A few weeks ago, I had the incredible opportunity to serve as an altar boy at the traditional Latin Mass for the first time. It was an honor to be part of something so special and beautiful. It was a moment of deep spiritual significance for me, allowing me to connect with the traditions enjoyed by Catholics for centuries, even my own ancestors. The experience profoundly changed my perspective on the liturgy, not just in my community, but in the church as a whole. The solemnity and reverence left a lasting impact on me, highlighting the beauty of Catholic worship. So today I'm going to share with you my experience serving at the Latin Mass, my journey to the Latin Mass, and some thoughts I was left with on the future of Roman Catholic liturgy. My name is Jacob, and this is Altare Dei. Serving as an altar boy was amazing. I'd been an altar boy for about 2 years already, but I'd only ever served in the ordinary form, or the Novus Ordo. I started going to Latin Mass around the same time that I became an altar boy, and at my first Latin Mass, I was so lost. I had no idea what was going on. I was like scrolling through the missal on my phone, just completely had no idea what I was experiencing. But I was moved to tears for reasons that I just could not explain. And it was a beautiful thing and the start of a beautiful story. Since then, I've been studying the history of the liturgy. Traditional Latin Mass, or the Tridentine Mass as it's officially called, was the exclusive Roman Catholic liturgy for about 400 years, from 1570 AD to the mid-1960s. And the Mass was eventually changed in the Second Vatican Council. The Latin Mass also remained popular as an extraordinary form of the Mass. So now we call the Novus Ordo the ordinary form and the Latin Mass the extraordinary form. The overall structure of Latin Mass is similar to Novus Ordo, but the order is different because it follows the 1962 Missal instead of the 2002 Missal, which we use in the Novus Ordo now. The prayers tend to be more elaborate and differently organized. Some things that you'll notice immediately about the Latin Mass is the fact that they use Gregorian chant. They only say the liturgy in Latin. For communion, they use altar rails or kneelers. The priest faces towards the altar, or ad orientem. For more in-depth explanation of the Latin Mass, I recommend the Religious Hippies video because that one goes into a lot more depth than I am here. While I still have a lot left to learn, I felt pretty prepared by the time that I started serving Latin Mass. I actually got to serve once before at a smaller Latin Mass in my own parish, which was good practice. A week later, I got the official training to serve in the Latin Mass, and even though I had to leave early, I still learned a lot of things. It was a lot more extensive than the training I had originally got for the Novus Ordo. I mean, there were designated positions for every little thing we did. You know, you have to keep your right thumb over your left when you're in prayer. You have to use your right hand to hold everything and keep your left hand on your chest. You have to sit with your hands on your knees. You have to wear gloves when you're holding the cross and the torches because they're made of gold. And you have to keep both arms at a 90-degree angle when you're holding them. It was a lot more to keep track of, but it was definitely very appropriate for what we were doing. And honestly, I think every altar server should be trained like that, even in the Novus Ordo, because it's a lot more reverent and it conduces reverence in a much stronger way. I tend to stick out at the Novus Ordo liturgies that I serve at because most of the other kids I serve with are just kind of casual about serving. You know, it's no big deal to them. We're called to a higher standard as altar servers that most altar servers that I know, sadly, don't reach. And I honestly, to be honest with you, I know altar girls who serve more reverently than the boys at my parish. And if that doesn't tell you that we boys need to step it up, I don't know what does. There was one young boy at the training. He was about 12 years old, and he was clearly seminary bound. I mean, he already goes to the Latin Mass, but he was so excited to be training, to be serving, because he was just jumping to answer all the trainer's questions. The trainer was talking about how when we wear collared shirts, we have to tuck in our collar because a white collar with a black cassock makes us look like we're priests wearing cassocks with collars, and we're not priests. And this kid goes, "Not yet, unfortunately." It was precious. It was adorable. But it was also an eye-opening thing for me to see the faith in this 12-year-old boy. I wish that I had this kid's religious fervor when I was 12. When I was 12, I didn't even think about God. When I was 12, I viewed God like that one uncle that you know, used to carry you as a baby and you see in pictures and you've never actually spoken to in person, you know, Theo God. I hope that my own children can be just as devoted and on fire for our Lord as this kid was, because it was just a beautiful thing to see. So the day finally comes for me to serve my first official TLM at the big Latin Mass community that is here in my diocese. And I am so nervous. I'm sweating like a pig and it's not even hot. I hadn't felt this nervous since my first time serving Novus Ordo at my parish 2 years earlier. I mean, it was that same sense. I suppose it's a good kind of nervous, but it was something that I'm not used to because I tend to get kind of used to serving. So at this new church, serving in a new liturgy, I am completely out of my league. And it didn't help that I'm also in this big, beautiful chapel run by our local Jesuit school, Belen, which was packed full of people on this random Sunday. So as we're preparing for Mass, I start to get to know some of the guys that I'm going to be serving with. And there were so many altar servers on this random Sunday that they had to start turning people away because too many boys wanted to serve at this Mass. We already had 13 people serving that day, which is a very good problem to have. You had kids who were like 7 years old and you had adults that were like 24, you know? So Mass starts and I'm serving as acolyte 2. So I'm one of the torch bearers that's leading the procession in. And as we're processing in, I still can't believe I'm doing this. I mean, I'm looking around at all these young people and all these families and people of all ages who are gathered together in this chapel, and I'm just amazed. I'm listening to these Gregorian chants being sung by this choir, and this organ that's being played masterfully, and this incense that's coming up into my nose, and all my senses are being stimulated. My sight, my smell. I'm just overwhelmed and overstimulated with the love of God. I know it's cliche to say, but I literally felt like I had died and gone to heaven, and I was serving at a liturgy with the angels. All that time that I spent watching those YouTube videos about the Latin Mass and studying them like some nerd finally paid off as I was kneeling there on that beautiful marble tile singing along with the Gregorian chants. They even sang Anima Christi during communion, which is one of my favorite hymns. All I could do was thank Jesus for allowing me to be there in that moment and pray that we'll get to experience this more often. That being said, there were a couple funny moments that went on during the Mass. Our MC got pulled aside for confession during the homily. So as Mass is going on, we stop for the homily and our MC disappears. And he was going to confession with the other priest who was in coro for that Mass. So we've got an altar server and a priest missing because they're doing confession. And we didn't know about this. It was on the spot. So we're all looking around like, where did our MC go? I gotta say, of all the liturgies I've served, that's never happened before. I've never had somebody go to confession during Mass. This community is full of surprises. Now, obviously, I had a few mess-ups too, since it was my first time. In the Latin Mass, the priest is only supposed to say the Our Father by himself, and the congregation only says the ending part, but deliver us from evil. But the moment that I heard him starting to say the Lord's Prayer, I got excited. And it's not that I didn't know that he was supposed to say it alone. I knew that, but I forgot because I was so excited. So I started singing the Pater Noster along with him. And immediately my other acolyte looks at me and I'm like, Pater no, sorry. Before communion, somebody tripped over the bells and I was just thanking God that that was not me. But afterwards, when we went back to our seats to kneel after receiving, I decide to move the bells out of the way so nobody else trips on them. And I didn't want to pick them up and have them ring. So I thought it was a good idea to slide them along this marble floor. And of course, they start making this horrible scraping sound like nails on a chalkboard. But I'm not done moving them, so I have to keep being like... So I tried to kind of move back against my chair, and I start sliding my chair too, so the chair is making scraping sounds and the bells are making scraping sounds, and I felt like every movement I made was a noise. When we came down the steps of the altar to process back outward, I bonked my torch against the step, and then it bonked against my face, and I was glad I was wearing my glasses, because I would have hit myself right in the eye. And as we're going out, there's a woman who left her stroller in the aisle. The three of us are going forward. I have to stop and let them keep going while I stand behind this stroller like a moron, waiting for her to move it. And I'm just there like... Speaking of which, there were a lot of little kids. You didn't go 5 minutes without hearing a baby crying or, wailing or fussing, or some little kid doing something, which is also another good problem to have, because as they say, if you don't hear crying, the church is dying. And there was a lot of crying, to say the least. Everybody was appropriately dressed. The women had veils and dresses, and the men had suits. I got such a strong sense of family from the people in this community, and everybody was so nice. Smiling faces everywhere I looked. I made a bunch of new friends that day. And I even had women handing me boxes of desserts and treats, and I came out with a box of donuts, because if you've ever been offered food by a Latina woman, you know there's no refusing that. Overall, I couldn't have asked for a better experience, and I was overjoyed for the rest of the day. It was amazing to serve in the very same liturgy that my own grandfather served in when he was in his youth. I tend to think of altar servers as representing angels, like angelic soldiers from heaven with a duty to their heavenly king. And I'm always trying to emulate that during Mass. It was nice to serve with people who shared that perspective and took it seriously. At the same time, they also made sure to let me know that I was not the only one messing up during that liturgy, which was comforting for me to hear as someone who was new to serving, because I felt like I was just a bull in a china shop. When you come out of a Latin Mass, you always have this sort of spiritual high that you're on. And I think this is because the aesthetic and the exterior beauty of the Latin Mass accurately reflects the interior beauty of the sacrament that's taking place. Of course, Mass is not about our feelings, and every Mass is inherently beautiful because of the sacrament, but I think we have a responsibility to communicate that beauty in the rituals and the traditions of that liturgy. When we receive communion, we're reaching the deepest intimacy with God that's possible. Heaven is meeting earth, and the traditional aesthetics of the Latin Mass are a lot more effective in conveying that holiness and making you really internalize the beauty of it. Unfortunately, most Novus Ordo liturgies are not like that. And this isn't some kind of political statement against the Novus Ordo. I love the Novus Ordo, I serve at it myself, but not every Novus Ordo conveys that same beauty because it doesn't utilize those kinds of traditions. And I think people would probably appreciate and attend Mass more often if every church was performing the liturgy with this sense of tradition and reverence and beauty, no matter the liturgical rite. A big part of it, I think, is also sacred music. The general instruction of the Roman Missal says that, quote, "The main place should be given, all things being equal, to Gregorian chant as being proper to the Roman liturgy. Other kinds of sacred music, in particular polyphony, are in no way excluded, provided that they correspond to the spirit of the liturgical action, and that they foster the participation of all the faithful. Since the faithful from different countries come together ever more frequently, it is desirable that they know how to sing together at least some parts of the ordinary of the Mass in Latin, especially the profession of faith and the Lord's Prayer, according to the simpler settings." It only took a few people and an organ to imitate the angelic sounds of heaven that morning. My own parish is blessed with insanely talented musicians, but sometimes I feel like they're not being used to their full potential. We have a big choir with a band with strings and violins and a piccolo and all these beautiful instrumentalists. And sometimes we do get to hear that traditional music at my parish, but it's between modern hymns and John Michael Talbot songs. And no disrespect to anyone at my parish, but even with all our musicians present on our most important solemnities, the music choice can still be a mixed bag. Seriously, if I have to hear "We Are One Body" or "Go Make a Difference" one more time, I'm gonna lose it. With all the beautiful hymnals and sacred music resources that exist today, you'd think more parishes would take advantage of that. I mean, it seems to appeal to the youth a lot more than the youth mass concept that a lot of parishes use. No offense, but it seems that the generation that most enjoyed youth mass is not in their youth anymore. Sacred music is meant to transport us up to heaven, but most Novus Ordo music puts me in the car listening to K-Love. Rather than imitating the sounds of the world, it should elevate our spirits and emulate the holiness of the Mass. There's a real shift in the air when you hear polyphony or Gregorian chant that's been around for centuries, and I think that that shift in the air really should maintain for the whole liturgy, not just one song during communion or during the offertory. For most of our parishes, the resources and the opportunities and the will is there. I simply wish that we'd build on that foundation that our ancestors laid for us, rather than relying on a formula from the past that doesn't seem to be reaching modern Catholics nearly as much. If it weren't for all the discarded traditions preserved only by the Latin Mass in most cases, I don't think that the modern Latin Mass revival movement would exist in the way that it does now. Along with Latin and Gregorian chant, it would seem that the other practices like Ad Orientem and communion rails have really become obscure outside of the Latin Mass, despite the fact that they were the norm for most of church history. None of these things were ever prohibited or banned from the liturgy. They simply fell out of use because one generation of Catholics wasn't interested in them. But that was 50 years ago. And now we see a growing younger generation of traditional Catholics that feel robbed of their history. This is where we get the liturgical divide that we see today. The Novus Ordo crowd sees the Latin Mass people as these nostalgic Pharisees who want to take the church backwards. But the Latin Mass people see the Novus Ordo people as irreverent modernists who are trapped in the 70s and want to suppress tradition. Both groups would rather antagonize each other through these caricatures than actually view each other as what they are, fellow Catholics who love the Mass. In fact, the caricatures about the Latin Mass people are what kept me away from the Latin Mass for a long time, because I thought that everyone who goes to a Latin Mass must be a rad trad who hates the Pope and opposes Vatican II and all these things. But once I actually got there, I realized very quickly that that was not true. Those rad trads exist, but they're actually just an extreme minority of people. And most of the people who go to the Latin Mass are just people like me, regular Catholics who enjoy tradition. We as a church should be striving towards unity, not division. It was our Lord himself who said that a house divided cannot stand. And unfortunately, I feel like having these Latin Mass restrictions that have been placed are only going to further this division rather than create more unity. If we want to unite the church liturgically, we have to address this divide with more than angry words and pointed fingers. The truth is, most Latin Mass attendees don't actually care what missal they're using. That's secondary. What they want is a reverent traditional liturgy. They want to feel like they're part of a tradition and a church that's bigger than themselves. This is also why a lot of Catholics take interest in the Eastern Rite and the Ordinariate. With newfound growth seen in every liturgy except the Novus Ordo, maybe we should ask ourselves if we're not the problem. In this modern world, young people, especially us Catholics, are itching for that sense of tradition, and oftentimes the Latin Mass is the only place where they can find it. And I can't blame them for having that exclusive preference given how much of a gamble the Novus Ordo can be. At least with Latin Mass, you can basically expect the same kind of standard of reverence wherever you go. But if Forrest Gump were Catholic, I think he'd agree that the Novus Ordo is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. Before my family found our parish, we did a lot of what I call parish hopping, which is where you go to a different church every Sunday. So I saw some pretty interesting liturgies as a kid. One of the parishes we went to had this finger-snapping jazz rendition of the Gloria, and another parish had like a full-on rock concert during Mass with guitars and drums during the Eucharistic prayer. On multiple occasions, I even got to experience liturgical dance, which is exactly what it sounds like. They had dancers come out with their ribbons during the liturgy and do choreography. Now, those are extreme examples, but it just goes to show that with a lot of Novus Ordo churches, you really just don't know what to expect. The Latin Mass movement exists largely as a reaction to this, because people are disaffected with the modern worship of a lot of Novus Ordos. Obedience is important, but how can we expect these people to just abandon the Latin Mass when they don't have any kind of stable alternative that maintains the reverence that they want? If we can begin to practice that same traditional reverence in the Novus Ordo, I think this liturgical divide would begin to close. Not fully, but somewhat. We need to reinforce the fact that the ordinary form and the extraordinary form are ultimately two expressions of the same thing and should feel like the same thing. That's why some of the most reverent Novus Ordos you can find are at Latin Mass parishes. We should allow the Latin Mass to inform our Novus Ordo celebrations liturgically so that people don't feel driven away to something else. And we should pray some parts of the Mass in Latin as encouraged by Vatican II, the general instruction of the Roman Missal, and every pope, including Francis. Priests should celebrate the Mass ad orientem to remind the people that Mass is not about us. It's about offering a holy sacrifice to God on the altar in the Eucharist. Father Mike Schmitz gives a great explanation of ad orientem in this clip.
We used to have Mass what they call ad orientem, which means to the east. And that's when you hear some people saying, oh, that was when the priest turned his back to the people. Sure, if you want to look at it that way. He's got his little secret prayers. Psst, 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 psst. Don't look, nobody. Psst, psst. Or it could be this. The ministerial priest is leading the kingdom priests up the mountain of God. And when he takes the Eucharist and he lifts it up to the Father, he's not doing this ignoring you. You are all with him saying like, yes, we're all lifting this up to the Father. So we lose something when I'm on this side of the altar and you're on that side of the altar because you just watch me pray. If I was your tour guide, if we were all climbing up a mountain and I was the leader of the mountaineers, I wouldn't like walk backwards and like, hey, everyone, come up the mountain here with me. On your right is this, on your left, whatever the directions are. What would happen? We'd do this. We'd say, you guys, let's go. We're all hiking up the mountain. Come on. We start going. Yep, question to turn around. Peace be with you, by the way. And keep, that kind of a thing. What would be highlighted? I'm not the one climbing the mountain. We're the ones climbing the mountain. On this side of the altar, I'm not the one saying the prayers. When we're doing this, The ministerial priest is leading a kingdom of priests in offering the sacrifice to the Father.
Along with that, we should reintroduce altar rails or communion kneelers, at least as an option during communion, and encourage kids to do the same in CCD. These things would foster reverence and belief in the true presence of the Eucharist. Now, I know that I'm going to get a lot of comments saying that a reverent Novus Ordo still can't compare to a Latin Mass because it loses a lot of the original prayers. And I can't say that you're wrong. Do I like all the reforms made by the Novus Ordo Missal? No. I think that there are a lot of things that should be restored and reincorporated because they're beautiful and they shouldn't have been taken away. Things like the prayers at the foot of the altar and the final gospel. These things are great and they should be kept in there. So you can use that to discount the Reverent Novus Ordo, but I would still maintain that the Reverent Novus Ordo is a step in the right direction because we're making the Mass more reverent. I also like a lot of the restorations made in the Novus Ordo, like the responsorial psalm, the Old Testament readings, and the prayers of the faithful. These things are not innovations. They have their roots in early church liturgy. To those of you who don't like how the Novus Ordo was constructed, I agree. But can we at least admit that there are positive elements that exist within it? Ideally, I would have had those positive elements incorporated into the Tridentine Missal to have something more like the ordinary at Mass. Perhaps one day we'll reach that perfect balance. But until then, we have to work with what we've got by re-implementing the exterior and aesthetic traditions of the Roman Rite. When you look at the attitude of many in the church today, it's clear that support for these traditions is growing, especially amongst the youth. And it's not just the laity. There are plenty of priests who would like to serve this way as well. The only reason why they don't is because they're afraid of the backlash they might get from their superiors because Susan from the parish council wrote an angry email to the pastor. However, from a pastoral perspective, it actually makes more sense to see that these liturgies become more traditional. Right now, we're at an interesting point as a church where the younger generation is the least religious generation in history. But now they're beginning to embrace Catholicism. And we have to ask ourselves, what version of Catholicism are they going to encounter when they finally decide to attend a Mass? Are they going to be presented with a church that's rooted in timeless tradition, which is what we're trying to sell them? Or are they going to find a church that's unsure of itself, hanging on by a thread because it's still stuck in the modern trends of yesteryear, catering to a generation past? Are they going to find the authentic, heavenly, and distinctly Catholic worship that they were promised? Or are they going to leave disappointed and look for it somewhere else? This is the question that we constantly have to be asking ourselves as we maneuver this younger generation of people. This modern culture is dying, and Catholicism has become a new counterculture. So if we want to prevail in this war against the modern world, then we have to be fighting side by side against the enemy, not amongst ourselves. To quote G.K. Chesterton, we don't want a church that will move with the world. We want a church that will move the world. And that's the difference. One church that's doing this and seeing immense growth in the process is St. John Cantius Catholic Church in Chicago. They offer Novus Ordo and Latin Mass liturgies, both in Latin, both ad orientem, both with Gregorian chant, and it's beautiful either way. So if you want to see how those two liturgies compare, click to watch this video right now. I hope you enjoyed, thank you for watching, and subscribe to Altare Dei for more uplifting Christian content. God bless you.